Hi, we continue in Genesis 31 today as Jacob has packed up all his children and all his cattle and all the slaves and all the donkeys and all the camels and all the wives and taken off to run away from Laban. And if anybody has ever suggested the Bible is boring with all its rules, etc., they obviously haven't read these stories with this great chase scene that if they had music in the background would build and suggest that Laban was coming to destroy Jacob and his family. Because as we'll see, the language is very much like what we saw in chapter 14 when Abraham, or Abram at the time, had to go rescue his nephew Lot, who had gotten caught in the war between the king of Sodom and all the other kings of the area. So we could expect from the language we're going to see in the pursuit that violence would ensue, but in fact a covenant ensues. Spoiler alert there if you were wondering about the suspense of it. And I'd like to suggest that's part of Genesis' anti-monarchical element here, that as we've been noting in the parallels between this story of Laban and his daughters and the allegory of the monarchy in exile, and we've been looking at these elements down here, especially the leaving, what share do we have in the inheritance of our father or in the reign of David's son Rehoboam, grandson Rehoboam, that one of the things that Genesis is suggesting is an alternatives to war, alternatives to violence. And here it will result in a covenant between two opposing parties and basically a border treaty that keeps them peaceful behind those lines. And so we'll get to that, but as we do, we have to see where we are in our story. And so as we've been looking at this whole section of Jacob and Laban here, and now we're on this final section here, and it'll return to match the first part with Jacob and Esau, as we'll see starting in chapter 32. And we've been reading this at each of these three levels: the immediate plot, in which in this moment Jacob and his family are trying to escape for their lives and get back to his homeland, as Yahweh has told him in a dream. But there's also ongoing the two nations in your womb, and we've noted that although Jacob will become Israel in the wrestling scene, when whoever he's wrestling with dubs him as Israel, the question of the two nations in your womb, which at one level is obviously Israel and Edom, because we hear a number of times in the chapters coming up Esau as Edom, but it can also be read as Israel and Judah, Judah being the fourth child of Leah, and not in Rebekah's womb, but sequentially in the sense that Jacob is the father, and she's the the mother of Jacob, obviously. So we can read that two nations at the level of Israel and Judah, or at the level of Israel and Edom, and it'll come out that way more in the return part when it's about Esau. But we can also read in this post-exilic element, because as I've been noting on the last couple of videos, there are many elements of who Laban is here as white, expressing the epithet of the moon god Sin, one of the chief gods and the chief fertility god of Haran, as well as of Ur, where Abram's father Terah emerged in the first place. But it's also the challenge of what does it mean to come out. And we saw last time that Laban had continued to deceive Jacob, had offered to keep giving him something to get him to stay, and Jacob realized it was never going to be the case, and they went through the whole deal with the colored animals and the white animals, and no matter how many times Jacob used his tricks there with the bearing of the white layers of the bark and the moving around of the strong and the feeble, Laban still, as Jacob told his wives out in the field, cheated him 10 times, and he'll say the same thing to Laban when they catch up. So we don't know of the details of what happened to the Judahite exiles in Babylon, but certainly the elite were the ones who were mostly brought there, and they would have been given many blandishments, certainly like many refugees from World War II, whether Japanese or German in the United States or elsewhere in Europe, who were given cushy jobs as scientists and educators and others, and it would be tempting to stay there and not to return home. Much like I'm sure many of the Judahite folks served the Babylonian king, as in the Ezra and Nehemiah outcome, the rebuilding of Jerusalem is established by people who are serving Yahweh, but also serving the Persian king. So that's part of the challenge here, is not to try to do the both and of worshiping the God of creation and the various systems of human power that claim other sources rather than the Creator. And so that's that other level we're looking at. We completed this large chiasm here that went from 28:10 to 31:18, and now we're on this one here, as well as this one. And as I've been noting throughout this section, it's not surprising there are overlapping chiasms. This first part of it here from 19 to 30 forms its own chiasm, but then this larger one we see from 19 to 55, because there's a lot of coming and going and a lot of reciprocity, so that fits the kind of chiastic structure that I've been highlighting from the beginning, that a chiasm is not an artificial shape, but a very natural element of life. Most people's everyday life is chiastic. You get out of bed, you have a meal, you go about your day, you come home, you have a meal, and you go to bed. Well, that's the basics of chiasm, or we could say one's life as well. One grows and one learns and one decays and one unlearns, if you will. And so chiasm is a natural, lively structure, and we see it a number of times here. And we're going to be focusing on this one here. We've also been noting the echoes of the wife-sister stories, and here when Laban catches Jacob, we'll hear the cry of "What have you done?" echoing out of chapters 12, 20, and 26 in the wife-sister stories, and yet we note all these inversions of the pattern as well. And I already noted the Laban and his daughters parallel here, and we have our key words for our section, and the translation often covers over the fact that the word for steal is 9 times here. So stealing my heart, sometimes it's translated as deceive, but clearly this is an element of stealing is throughout this whole scene here. And that is part of the accusation that Jacob had heard that Laban's sons were saying that Jacob had stolen all the property that belonged to Laban, but Jacob, of course, argued in the last scene that it was God who had taken it away from Laban, not Jacob. And so the stealing theme will continue to play out here, and it will play out here when it comes around the question of the teraphim, which will echo another element from the monarchy story and the story of Michal using the teraphim to deceive her father Saul when David got away. But we'll get there in a scene coming up. So let's start right here, and we're just going to get through the center of this short chiasm here as we see this chase scene unfold. And we'll see that Laban is characterized in a new way here, and we'll get there in just a moment. So Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and as Westerman notes, as well as many other scholars, shearing is a festal celebration at the place where the flocks are resting. So given how many sheep they seem to have, that would involve drunkenness and setting up tents out in the field and a grand celebration of shearing, and they would be doing that seemingly not knowing what was going on with Jacob and his family, and that's the occasion for him to take off. And then the narrator tells us something very interesting that we know and Rachel knows, but Jacob does not know, and Laban certainly does not know, and that's going to be key as the scene unfolds. Not what we look at today, but what will happen later. She stole her father's household gods, described here as teraphim. They'll also be described as Elohim elsewhere, but we'll see them as teraphim, only here and in 1 Samuel. As Sarna suggests, the word perhaps is derived from various roots meaning to be limp or without energy, to decay, to become foul, and plainly that's a pejorative label from Hebrew on other people's objects, much as idolatry or idols is the way people label other people's worship. Nobody ever refers to their own things as idols. And the teraphim, although only here in Genesis, are condemned throughout Hebrew scripture, and we see a number of occasions here. And as Westerman notes, its first use here leaves readers wondering what Laban was doing with them, or it, although original audience likely had understood that teraphim conferred protection and blessing. The word is singular in meaning, even though it's plural in form at the theme ending. And as I've been noting throughout this, it's curious that Laban is described as being in relationship, as we see down here, with Elohim, and earlier with Yahweh, the gods of foreign people from his perspective, and never seen as associated with Marduk or sin. And yet these teraphim may well reflect that, although they're never given names that are associated with anything we know from the Mesopotamian culture. And that's especially interesting because in this next verse, Laban is described not as a Mesopotamian, but as an Aramaean. And again here in verse 4, and Westerman notes otherwise only in P, but that's not the point here. We're not trying to look at source theory. As Jinsan notes, it defines Laban as the outsider. It's part of a wordplay, arami, invoking the stem ram, to cheat. And so as Sarna notes, Laban the heartless cheat has been beaten at his own game. But there's another level of this. There are 2 other echoes of Aramaean that we can look at in the Bible that are interesting. One is in Deuteronomy 26:5, and we see this. You shall make this responsive for Yahweh your God. A wandering Aramaean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as a ger, as an alien, few in number, and there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. So that's certainly suggesting Israelites, but it's interesting, not described as Israelites there in Deuteronomy, but as an Aramaean who ended up in Egypt and became populous and then abused by the Egyptians. And so that would make Laban related to the very people who were in Egypt. But we look at another perspective, as we can see from this example from Kings. The king of Aram was an enemy. Here describes an adversary in the Hebrew, Satan, from the Persian there, an accuser. And the king of Aramea is often an enemy. And so that's during the time of the monarchy, and that's in the land. That's not a Mesopotamian reference. So it's a very interesting element there that he's described as an Aramaean. And if we look at the map of Jacob's travels here from Haran back down to Beersheba, we see that nothing here is described as Aramea in that sense. So we see Gilead here that he's on his way to, but not Aramea. So that's an interesting element of that, as we'll see. So Jacob deceived, or literally stole, the heart of Laban, in that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. And here's the narrator providing that judgment on it. It doesn't take Laban to discern it or us as readers to discern it. The narrator makes it quite plain. And also not embarrassed about it or ashamed of it, doesn't feel the need to protect Jacob, as many people do, especially need to protect Rachel from the charge of theft. But the text isn't concerned with that. So we see in these other verses the escape and the hostile pursuit echo what we saw in chapter 14, verses 14 to 15, with another uncle pursuing his nephew. But there Abraham was pursuing Lot to rescue him, and here Laban is pursuing Jacob to confront him. And so he, intending to flee, and he fled. And so the fleeing is a key word, as we can see throughout here. With all that he had, starting out, he crossed the Euphrates, or literally the river, Hahanar. The Nile is described as the river in Exodus, but here the Euphrates is plainly the river. It's only at Eden otherwise, and it was by name in that broad seam where Yahweh, or Elohim in that case, told where Elohim told Abram that everything he could lift up his eyes and see, he'd be given all the way to the great river. But that's not the case now. So he's leaving the Euphrates, which is clearly a reference to the old country, despite the reference to Aram here, and set his face on the hill country of Gilead. Why there? Well, it's certainly on the way to Beersheba, but as you can see from Google Maps here, it's a long way, and it's out in the open country, and Laban is going to pursue. It's not all the way home, but that's his goal for now, is to set his face for the hill country of Gilead. And we see hill country of Gilead is a key word repeated several times in this section, even though it's first here. It'll only be in 37:25 outside this scene. Later, Gilead will be described as the offspring of Manasseh, thus from Joseph, and we see that in Numbers a couple of times in the Song of Songs, but that's not particularly relevant to our situation here. So Jacob gets a 3-day head start, much as Laban got a 3-day head start with taking the colored animals away before Jacob could engage in his program of transforming the animals from Laban's, from the white ones, to his. So Laban on the 3rd day was told that Jacob had fled. Who told him? Who do we know? How do we know? How do we know in the previous scene that Jacob had heard that Laban was not looking favorably at him anymore? There's certainly some kind of network of communication going on here. But Laban is now hearing something about Jacob being 3 days away. Why would somebody be waiting 3 days to tell him? They certainly didn't just discover it now. So there's something very suspicious there about it taking 3 days for Laban to find out that Jacob had fled, but we don't hear anything more about that. And so he took his kinfolk with him. Plainly that doesn't involve his daughters who were with Jacob, but it involves his sons that we heard were jealous of Jacob, and pursued him. And notice that pursued him and caught up with him, as if it was Laban and his kinfolk against only Jacob. But we've already seen from the last scene that Jacob has his 2 wives, and we're going to find out the maidservants as well, and the 12 children, as well as the slaves and everybody else. But the way it's described here by the narrator makes it sound like it's Laban and his whole company against poor Jacob alone. So he took his kinfolk and pursued him for 7 days, again using a word that's only in that scene in chapter 14. Makes it a military rescue scene, and it's only one other time in 35:5, which is a similar kind of scene. And as Turner notes, as I was noting, not the first time that an uncle has pursued his nephew. And it's a 7-day chase. Even then, as Sarna notes, it implies they would have to be going incredibly fast to go 400 miles, whether that's on horseback or on foot or on the anachronistic image of the camel that Jacob put his women on. We don't know. But Sarna suggests that these are symbolic numbers and not literal numbers, and that may well be. The 7 days certainly being similar to the week for which Jacob worked for the wives, which is, of course, 7 years. And he caught up with them using the word devak here, which is a word of intimacy. It's what a man does with his woman, leaves his family and clings to his woman in the garden. It's what happened in chapter 19 when the disaster was overtaking Sodom. And it'll be in chapter 34 when Shechem is drawn to Dinah after the rape. And so all these have seen intimations of intimacy here, and that's what's being suggested here, that he's going to get up close with Jacob when he gets there, and now he's caught him. But right at the center of our little chiasm, there's a sudden little escape here, as if. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night, presumably that very night, and said, "Take heed," which is a bad translation here. I've noted earlier when it translates Shema, no need for the formality. We could just say listen. But here it's Shema, or watch. So it's not about listening, it's about watching. Watch that you say not a word to Jacob, either good or bad. Notice, just like what we saw in verse 3, when Yahweh came to Jacob but didn't identify itself as Yahweh, Jacob only heard, "Return to the land of your homeland." Here, no voice is given, and we don't know that Laban knows who this voice is telling him, "Watch that you say not a word." Why he would assume that it's the God of Jacob's father, as we'll see him described right here, we don't know, or is that propaganda on his part? And one thing we have to recognize as we anticipate the conversation here, just as we did with Jacob's argument to his wives in the last scene, why should we trust either of these characters? We know that both Laban and Jacob have been perfectly willing to lie to each other directly to their faces, not just to be incomplete and say things that don't quite make a commitment, like ask what I should give you and I will give it to you, which isn't quite saying anything, but the direct lying when Jacob said that let me have this and I will continue to care for your animals, for example, or that Laban would pay him when Jacob has already said once and will say again, "You've cheated me 10 times, and if I hadn't left, you'd never pay me." So we have to be very careful in the exchange that happens when Laban overtook Jacob, to see whether this conversation is something we can trust, whether they can trust each other. And that's where we'll pick it up next time in that conversation. See you then for that.